Hello, everyone. I'd like to tell you very briefly about my new book. It's called An ABC of Childhood Tragedy. Mid-October right now. It's coming out just in a few days. I wrote these poems. It's 26 poems, one for each letter of the alphabet. I wrote these poems when I was doing a lot of clinical work and seeing the sorts of terrible things that happened within people's families. And I suppose in some sense it was an attempt to blow off some steam. The book itself and the project is an attempt to investigate the nexus, let's say, of beauty and tragedy and humor, a strange triad. And maybe I'll read you a couple of the alphabet poems, so you get some sense of what you're in for if you dare to buy the book. It's pretty rough, so be warned. A. Adela, an abusive sprat, was fond of teasing little brats. They finally jumped her one fine day, and now Adela's locked away. D. This is a very rough one. Dick was a damaged little boy whose prancing father made him coy. When he ended up in jail, all competed for his tail. F. Frederick was sadly flawed after he was madly pawed by his neighbor, deeply awed. Where the hell was Christian God? Well, so these are a bit Brothers Grimm-like, I suppose. Pretty brutal, terribly comical, perhaps, if you have that sense of humor. We have some music coming out to accompany it. It'll be quite a contentious project, to say the least. And so if you're interested in such things, if you like The Nightmare Before Christmas, if you like Edward Gorey and his Victorian catastrophes in poetic form, then maybe you'll like the ABC of Childhood Tragedy. Ha! Happy reading, folks.
Well, welcome everybody to this week's episode of Give Them an Argument. My name is David Griscom. I'm commandeering the ship. Going to be running the show in absence of our fearless captain, Ben Burgess, this week. We got some inspiring stuff to get to. I mean, Jordan Peterson is going to be joining us later to cheer us up with some children's bedtime stories, which I'm very, very looking forward to doing. In just a bit, we're going to be joined by the excellent journalist and a friend of ours, Kurt Hackbarth, to talk about AMLO and Mexico and some of the really wild rhetoric that we've been getting in this country about what's happening in the country of, to our south. And I'm really, really thrilled to be doing this. I'm usually on the other side, so forgive me if there's any kind of technical difficulties or hiccups as we do it, but really thrilled to be here. And thanks so much, Jake and Andy, for doing this with me.
Hey, no problem. And you are the captain now.
Yeah.
No one better to steer the ship. That was pretty wild how you took it from Ben. That was aggressive and violent. now you commandeering the show.
Yeah.
We're happy
that little boat you rode up on with the AK was amazing.
I mean, I'm just happy that y'all went along with it. I was a little worried that his first mates might be a little, aggressive, but they're very happy for the new leadership. So we're gonna be having fun tonight. Doing things. We're trying to keep it in the spirit. We might be doing things a little bit differently. So I mean, we got plenty to get to, so no reason in sort of dancing about it at the front. We got two quick stories to do before we bring on Mr. Hackbarth. And the first one I want to start with is something that's been happening right here in Austin, Texas. I'll tell you, as somebody who's from here and sort of seen when Austin first started to get like on those lists of like best cities to live, I remember all of us being like, oh man, that's so wonderful that we're being recognized. But now as you go through the past few decades and have seen what that kind of attention has meant for the city, whenever we're in national news, I always get a little bit worried. And there's a new example of this with policing, which is pretty interesting. And I think we have this first Breitbart clip to set us up here. Love that graphic at the end. So look, I'm not going to be one of these people who's going to sit here and like celebrate like a moment like that, right? I just think that like creating chaos in streets is just not something that I feel like I want to endorse. But of course, this is an incident that the right wing has sort of latched onto, and it's been latched onto both by local politicians, as you're seeing right there. Breitbart, Fox News was covering it. A lot of weird people on Rumble were covering it as basically this is what happens when you defund the police. This is the chaos and anarchy that happens. And I think it's important here to bring in some local context as to what's going on. First of all, this is not something that's isolated to Austin. These kind of donut events and things like that have actually been happening all across the state in the past couple of years. It's a bit of a trend, right? But of course, the one that happened right here in Austin is the one that people have been latching onto because there's a reason. Again, in the general sense of this being something that's happening all across the state, I think it's really telling because one of the big arguments, the big things that people are lashing onto, that the right wing is lashing onto, is that basically the police were so powerless to deal with this kind of thing. And just rewinding a little bit and giving people some context, I think is really important here, because this happened very, very shortly after a very, very important and momentous vote in the Austin City Council. Effectively, the police department had been funding a fake grassroots organization that had been going around the city, getting people to sign a petition that put this ridiculous grab bag of police department, police union dreams and hopes and wishes on the ballot in May. There was also another petition that is going to be on the ballot in May that is calling for very, very robust police oversight. And the fake police petition, they were sending people out there and lying to folks, telling people that, oh, you want this kind of reform of the police, you want this kind of oversight, that's what's in here. They lied to all kinds of people. And I'll also tell you this, they lied to my mother. And when you start messing with my mother, these things get a little personal for me, right? But they were able to gather tremendous amounts of signatures. That's going to be on the ballot in May. Meanwhile, our disgraced former, thank the Lord, city manager, in the last few days of his tenure, after he had failed to keep the lights on during the winter storm that we just experienced, in the last few days of his tenure, he negotiated out of nowhere this 4-year police contract that, didn't have the oversight that activists and the public clearly want to see represented in the city. Out of nowhere, he pulls out this police contract out of his ass. And people showed up at city council. I was one of them, to basically go there and say, we don't want this. We think that the people should be able to decide whether or not we want to see more police oversight than we currently have in this city. The police union was there in full force, and they basically made a big stink saying, this is demoralizing the police. This is preventing us from doing our job. You guys want to make sure that we can't attack people in the street, that we can't get away with the murders that are unfortunately rampant in Austin when it comes to police using deadly force on Austinites, right? They came forward and were pushing back, and they lost. The city council voted with the people, and in May, there will be an election so the people here can decide how much oversight they want over the police department. It's very, very convenient that a few days later, at a major intersection, something like this was allowed to happen, right? Oh, something like this. Oh, there's not enough police, right? Because the progressives and the DSA and the left are too radical. So there's not enough police to deal with something that is a very, very clear mandate of any kind of rational policing system, preventing chaos like that in the streets, right? So I wanted to give that context here because unlike the way that the right is trying to frame it, that like Austin has fallen into anarchy, Austin has fallen into chaos. These things are, in my opinion, intentional, right? You make decisions about how many people you're going to be sending, something like that. You're letting something like that happen. That is a very convenient if it's an accident for the police department, something like that happen. We have and then on top of this, there's this history of back a few years ago, there were some reshuffling of the police budget to fund kind of social programs and community programs in the city instead of just going to funding the police department. Greg Abbott has stepped in and has basically outlawed that practice. So now the Austin Police Department is more funded than it's ever been in its history. So anyone who's sitting here saying, oh, the Austin Police Department is defunded, you should show them what the police budget looks like, because they have never had more money than they do right now. Yeah, we do have this here. So this is this is what's going to happen. So basically there's a 1-year contract extension that's going to go on so that people can vote on it in May. And this new plan that the police are getting includes, one, a 4% increase in pay, 15% incentives for new cadets, retention incentives for current Austin Police Department officers, pay increases for officers nearing retirement, continuation of longevity pay, field training officer pay, mental health certification pay, bilingual pay, shift differential pay, assistant chief pay, right? So when it comes to like, oh, there's not enough money in this department, these people aren't getting paid, it's nonsensical. And in fact, we have this video here of our mayor, Mayor Watson, being told that the fact that Austin is having issues, it's correct, Austin is having issues staffing their police department, but that's not a unique Austin issue. If we play this video right here, you'll hear that it's something that's happening all across the state of Texas.
It's my understanding that yesterday, Colonel McCraw, the leader of DPS, testified at a House, I think it was an Appropriations Committee, on their legislative appropriation request, that they were over 500, I think I'm right about this, sworn officers short, and they were having difficulty recruiting to get to their full staffing levels. And when I read national reports, it appears that, and while there's going to be something unique to every city, and I don't want to, and there will be things unique to Austin, and I don't want to minimize that, but hiring police officers and meeting staffing levels, that is not a uniquely Austin problem. Is that right?
Oh, not at all. That's correct. Big cities particularly are struggling with it, but even for small departments, and I would tell you in the state of Texas, the average size police department is about 7 to 12 police officers. Even having 1 or 2 missing, I mean, you do the percentage, it's a similar thing for them. So all police departments right now are struggling with staffing, sworn and civilian.
Thank you, Chief.
Yeah.
Officer Smallberry's there. Seems like he's about to cry.
Yeah. Well, the point is that like the consequence of decisions that have been made in the city of Austin in conversation with residents of the city of Austin are not what is responsible for like hiring shortages. And the police union and their supporters, they look at any kind of incident like what happened on Lamar, just a couple weeks back, and they basically say, well, this is exactly what happens when you do this thing. And it's not the case, because all police departments in the state are suffering from a lack of ability to recruit police officers. So whenever you hear this, oh, well, all these police officers are quitting, all of the stuff that is happening, it's nonsensical. And just before we get to this Abbott thing, I'm going to pull this up right quick for y'all. I have this here. If you can share it, Jake. There's this narrative too that Austin is becoming like uniquely unsafe. And like, as a good Texan, I'll ignore the other cities here. But this is from a Bloomberg piece. Murder rates fell in most big United States cities in 2022. As a good Texan, I'll ignore these other cities. But you'll notice here that here's Houston, there's Dallas, there's San Antonio, and you have to go all the way to the bottom. Oh, there it is, to find Austin, right? So even compared to other large cities in the state of Texas, Austin is an extremely safe place to be. So this fear mongering that we've been getting from the right wing is nonsensical. It's not reflective of reality. What is reflective of reality, if you could pull up this Abbott tweet right quick, what is reflective of reality is that the right and these police unions are trying to prevent people from having a say in the way that they want policing to be done in their city. Greg Abbott, of course, citing the New York Post, by the way. Cops quit woke Austin in droves. Austin must still comply with the law I signed that defunds cities that defund their police. If Austin doesn't maintain its police force, it will not be able to take more taxpayer money and spend it on non-police matters, right? And again, the problem with Austin and the police department are not problems of funding. right? As I said, the Austin Police Department is funded more than it's ever been in its history, right? Historic. The problems with being able to recruit and retain officers is not a unique problem to Austin. It's happening in cities like Dallas. It's happening in cities like Houston. It's happening in cities like San Antonio. What this is the police department. Remember what I said at the beginning of this segment. The police department was literally funding people to lie to the public and say, you can sign a petition that is not representing what you're actually signing, right? They have a contempt for democracy, and they are aided by people like Greg Abbott. They are aided by people like the folks at Breitbart. They're aided by people like the folks at Fox News to say, we don't believe that the public should be able to oversee the folks who are walking around the streets with weapons and unfortunately have used those to murder people who were lawful, who weren't engaged in any kind of criminal activity, brutal police murders, things that should not be happening in any place. And they don't want there to be an oversight system that is not completely controlled by the police department, right? And it's something that, if you're not in Austin, if you're not in Texas, it should worry you when you see the tactics that police are using to basically try to subvert democracy and say, we're above the law and we are above the democratic process, because all of this stuff is way too convenient. The facts of the matter are muddied on purpose to basically create a false narrative so that police can scaremonger folks so that they don't have to have any accountability, so that they basically get a blank check to do whatever they want. And it's not about public safety.
Yeah, I mean, you saw on that list, New York was one of the few cities below Austin on that list, and I have it queued up. But there's all sorts of articles by conservatives like, "Oh, I'm afraid to leave my house," or it might have just been a tweet, but someone saying like, "Oh, it hasn't been this bad since the '80s or even the '80s." But if you just look at objectives, of course, if I guess we're seeing that the murder rate actually dropped, even because there's a bit of it in 2020, I think.
During COVID there was a murder wave, right? And there's
right.
it's worth acknowledging and trying to figure out ways to avoid that kind of thing. But again, no, I mean, especially when you're talking about a city like the targets of this kind of stuff are never like the places where it's a real problem.
No,
it's always a place where there's a political problem for the right to basically try to use these things so that they can get what they want.
100%. I mean, it's you don't want to go too far and say, "Oh, crime isn't a problem," right? Because we've seen, that's a way to be kind of condescending to really often it's working class people that are dealing with the brunt of any increase in crime. But you also don't want to get to so much conservative fear mongering about how these cities are hellholes when they're basically historically safe, right? Some of these like New York and being too examples.
I mean, even Baltimore. I used to have a studio in Baltimore, like not even in a good part of Baltimore, it was in wire country, and it was I felt safe. I wouldn't necessarily say it's the neighborhood didn't have the money, but I felt safe going around there. Now if you go south of Baltimore to Catonsville, that is where they had which I drove by this McDonald's every single day to get to my studio, but a trans woman was beaten to death in the bathroom there. And so it's like, no, Baltimore, okay, Baltimore has its issues. Granted, yeah, there is a high murder rate, but I felt safe in what would some people would call a sketchy part of town.
I mean, I hear what you're saying in the sense of like the way they try to make it seem like you can't walk around the streets of New York, or you can't walk around the streets of Austin without like being mugged or being murdered, right? It's just not, attached to like the facts or the reality, right?
Yeah, because I was murdered 3 times during the live show.
Sorry?
I was murdered 3 times during the live show.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it is a very funny thing that like the macho culture right now in the US is basically to say that they're afraid of walking around the streets where the vast majority of the country lives in major like urban parts of the country, right? It shows like a detachment from reality, and like I think it's important. Like the thing that's been really helpful here is that I think voters are fairly fed up with it. There's been this group called Save Austin Now here, which is basically tried to catch some of like the conservative backlash to some policies that were put in place in like 2019, 2020. And they were successful in putting in place like one of the most horrific anti-homeless referendums, right? That basically like criminalized camping in the city. But since then, I think most people have been able to see through it, and they've failed on their other ballot initiatives. I feel very confident, and I hope I'm not going to eat crow on this. I feel very confident that in May, when voters are able to decide if they want more police oversight or if they want to give the police a grab bag to do whatever the hell they want, people are going to vote for oversight. And look, this is like the fundamental point here. The reason that I bring this up, apart from the fact that this is like national news, apart from the fact that like police oversight is something that's really important, it also shows how willing the police are to basically try to subvert and avoid democracy. We played it on Left Reckoning. We had people who have been doing a lot of great work here in the city of Austin, where they literally have audio recordings of these people who were funded by the police union here, lying to people and saying they were not only the kind of other stuff is like basically whatever you want on this is what's on this petition, right? Is basically how they did it. But they also misrepresented themselves as part of a racial justice group here called Equity Austin. So regularly they said, we are from Equity Austin, right? Which people know in the city as like, oh, this is a racial justice organization, I trust them, right? Straight up lying. And like, is it illegal? It's sort of in that gray area, right? And just it just is very revealing to me about the way that the police departments are willing to conduct themselves in the city of Austin. I think across the country. I mean, in New York, everyone's least favorite mayor, De Blasio. Remember, he had his daughter docked by the police department in New York City when she was shown attending some, George Floyd protests. I don't know if y'all remember that, but like the police department literally doxing the daughter of the mayor of New York City, right? Because they were mad at some of her political opinions, right? You got to be really clear about these things. These are agencies that are rogue. These are agencies that do not want democratic oversight, and they see themselves as separate from the political process instead of institutions that are supposed to serve at the will and the behest of the democratic system that we have in this country. Well, folks, I think we're probably going to have to jump to this East Palestine and Alabama story after our Kurt interview, just for time. So I wanted to bring up, one of the fundamental factors about the right as well in the state, since I'm taking over the show and I'm going to do my favorite thing, which is talk about the great state of Texas. The fact that Greg Abbott is also saying that, is trying to utilize the full powers of the state to basically deny the right of people in cities like Austin to determine their own destiny flies in the face of any of these kind of arguments about small government, right? Local government's good, small government is the best. And look, at a certain point, you can only point out the hypocrisy of the Republicans so much, right? But I think it really does show a lack of worry that these people have. And because of the weakness of the Democratic Party in the state of Texas, they don't have to have a lot of worries. They're way more worried about their more rabid far-right base, which represents probably like 5% of the population here, than they are about sort of pissing off the significant amount of people who live in cities like Dallas, who live in cities like Houston. And you see that in Abbott basically saying that they're going to defund cities, right? Which is a disgusting concept, because what that means is taking away state level funding for important health programs, for things like schools, for things like maintaining roads, all that kind of stuff. But if you've been following my work, if you're not familiar with me, I have a really long piece in Jacobin that came out after Beto got destroyed again by Greg Abbott, which basically outlines how Greg Abbott has been able to become the most powerful governor in the state of Texas. And Andy, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but about Texas governor system, we have what's called a weak governor system, right? So the governor is not in the position like they are in a lot of other states where they hold a lot of executive power. Traditionally, most of the executive power is held by commissions and boards in the state. But because the Republicans have been in control of the state of Texas for so long, right? He basically has effective control over these systems. And he's utilized to extend his control? COVID-19.
Of course.
He has extended the disaster declaration in the state of Texas on COVID-19 from the get-go. And has he been using that to implement like health programs in the state? Has he been utilizing that to protect people? No, he's been utilizing that to prevent cities and localities from maybe putting in a kind of a mask mandate or certain kind of basic healthcare procedures, and to use the emergency powers that he gets when he puts forward a disaster declaration so that he can reshuffle money to doing things like Operation Lone Star, which is this parallel border patrol operation that he's been doing here that has wasted billions of dollars and just harassing. And it's not even been effective by the own metrics that he puts forward, right? Not that I agree or want them to be successful. It's just been an absolute failure. It's a pure political stunt. But he's been able to basically reshuffle the entire system here in a way that really should worry folks. It's bad enough that you just have Republican control over these things. He's pushing up against the state constitution of Texas and has rapidly changed the office of the governor into one of the most powerful institutions in the state that in a lot of ways is even on top of the legislature, where traditionally power is held.
Man, I mean, when I was there, I'll fully admit that was when Ann Richards was still governor. So, that was back whenever there was a baby Griscom.
It's very true.
It's a while ago, but yeah, the state seems to have completely changed from when I was there, because I remember it was very, there was a Texas pride. I remember Vanilla Ice, whenever he first broke out, like everybody was just like, "Oh, he's a Texan. He's a Texan." Like you see, like all these people who hate rap music loving Vanilla Ice because he's from Texas, and then Vanilla Ice comes out and starts trashing Texas, and we dropped him hotter, like he was a hot potato. But way before the rest of the country caught on.
Yeah.
But so I mean, I think it just seems to me that Texas is not the same place that I left. It's not the it's like a lot of people who because like New York City was always the place where creative people would always kind of head off to. I think Texas has become like the place where like people from the Midwest, like the worst people from the Midwest, have decided that they're going to go to it so they can cosplay as a cowboy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like, Austin has always been a great home for people from wherever, and I don't think it's worth like pulling up the drawbridge. What I think has happened here is because the Democratic Party has like fallen into complete crisis. The Republican Party basically dominating since Ann Richards. You haven't had a statewide Democrat win office in the state of Texas, means that the Republican Party not only like the Republican Party is like not even reflective of Texans. You look at a lot of the things that they've passed, like for example, like constitutional carry, right, which was like a focus group tested like terminology, to create a completely backwards gun program in the state, where like the first laws that were passed in Texas and these major cities, like going all the way back to the 1800s, were rules about not carrying knives in public and not carrying guns in public, right? So if you want to go back to tradition, like those are actually some of the more traditional Texan positions on these things. But if you look at the the gun laws here, the people who support them, it's not just like usually when you say minority, it's like 40%. Like it's literally like 5 to 7% of people want these kind of things. So what we're getting is like a more and more authoritarian, a more and more right-wing government, and a government that, like, even if you want to say that the general trend in Texas is like in a certain direction, is like not even reflective of that trend.
Yeah, and just I remember too, just people who want to play cowboy. Just reminder: the OK Corral was about gun control.
Yeah, no, Matt brings that up all the time too.
Yeah,
do we have Kurt here?
Yeah, we have Kurt in the digital bill. We can bring him out whenever we're ready.
Okay, well, wonderful. I just want to make sure I can't see that. I mean, we got more to get to. We're going to bring Kurt on in just one second. Don't forget, folks, join us in the post game. We have these amazing Jordan Peterson poems. We're going to have a live read. And I think we're going to have C. Derek Varn join us for that as well. Everyone's favorite lad. We might come back, depending on how long the Kurt interview goes, and talk a little bit about East Palestine, but we'll have to decide as it goes. But without further ado, don't want to waste any more of his time. We really appreciate having Kurt Hackbarth on the program. It's always such a pleasure, and thanks so much, Jake and Andy, excuse me, for chilling. How's it going, Kurt?
It's going good, David, except for the fact that I heard some of those Jordan Peterson poems and I got really weirded out. So I don't know if I can really do this interview with the same kind of concentration that I'd been expecting to have.
It's pretty dark. I have to put that in the dark corner of my mind.
If you have that kind of sense of humor, you know.
I mean, yeah, we all know he's a very strange individual. But I mean, we're going to be talking about some strange individuals in just a second.
Indeed.
Kurt, I mean, I always appreciate talking with you, and I brought you on, this week because I wanted to ask you a very simple question: is Mexico's democracy in danger? And for listeners, if you haven't been paying attention, things have been getting very, very wild in Mexico. Go back to 2018, where in the presidential election, AMLO wins the presidential election, beating his opponent by a sizable margin, by the way. In 2021, there is a the right boycotted another referendum that AMLO wins on his presidency. And AMLO's approval ratings have stubbornly stayed above 60% in the country. But despite AMLO's popularity and the fact that he continues to win elections, if you read the American press, dictatorship is brewing in Mexico. A highly popular, democratically elected president is governing. So to talk about this more in depth, I think there's no one better. And if you all see here, it might not be super clear for y'all, but that green line is AMLO's popularity over these past few years, and you might not be able to see, but over 60%, which would be amazing by American standards for a president to be able to hold that. But to talk more about this, we have Kurt Hackbarth, who is a journalist whose work you can read in Jacobin, joining us. Kurt, how's it going?
Going good, David. And, the nerve of AMLO to continue to be popular, despite the best attempts of the New York Times and the Atlantic Monthly, right?
And David,
British NGOs.
And David let's remember, some of the people we're going to talk about, Barr, right? Trump's boy, David Frum. You should start to get worried when you hear the cast of characters who are starting to beat the drums on AMLO. But maybe and to set this up really quick, Kurt has a really great piece in Jacobin that y'all should all read. No, AMLO is not undermining Mexican democracy. Kurt, I mean, I want to talk about a lot of things with you, but let's just start with this first bit.
Sure.
Could you tell people what the National Electoral Institute is, the INE, and what AMLO is doing around it, and what seems to have all of these people in DC and in the New York Times and Atlantic office is so worried?
Yeah, it turns out all of a sudden everybody's an expert, right, in Mexico's electoral system, and they're so very concerned about it. So a little bit of background on this. Unlike the United States, where elections are a federal matter, in Mexico Mexico's also a federal system, but there's a national electoral system that oversees elections, in theory. And this came about through the reforms of the late 90s. And what was created was called the IFE, right, or the Federal Electoral Institute, which after the election of 2006 acquired the nickname the Instituto de Fraude Electoral, the Electoral Fraud Institute, which led to a series of reforms, and then the IFE became renamed as the INE, right? And now all of a sudden, American publications and the Mexican right, unable to win, elections. Let's here that AMLO won a landslide election in 2018 and won control of both houses of Congress, something which was reinstated in 2021 when he held control of Congress again in the midterms elections, and then the referendum that you mentioned at the beginning, right? So what you have here is a right-wing minority in the country, they're all in their trench there in the few areas of the government which they continue to control. One of them is the Electoral Institute, which has, a conservative majority on its board. And they've tried to blow up a very minor electoral reform into a major issue of AMLO being an authoritarian autocrat and liberal democracy is at risk. And Mexico is, about to become the next failed state, whatever else. I want to give a little bit of context here as well. First of all, this is a very, it's a very minor reform. I talk about it in my piece. It's mostly has to do with cost cutting, do with, there's a constitutional provision in Mexico that knew that nobody can earn more than the president, because Mexico has a long history of just exorbitant salaries at the federal level. It kind of eliminates duplicate functions between local and district level electoral councils. This is mostly what it does. And then there is actually some very good things that it does. It facilitates voting rights for the disabled, those people who are in pretrial detention, which is important. I think it's been a big struggle in the US for people who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated to have the right to vote. That's in this electoral reform. And then the big thing is migrants living abroad, right? I mean, Mexico is a country of migrants, right? And these people have never been able, even Mexican, being Mexican citizens, have been able to vote effectively, right? So the law takes measures now to allow these millions of Mexicans to be allowed to vote. Now, conservatives hate this because Mexicans abroad tend to vote for AMLO's party, Morena. That's just, And so they're trying to make a big fuss about the fact that, well, these people don't have voting ID cards, because in Mexico, ID cards are mandatory. How could they vote with their passports? There's going to be all kinds of fraud. As if the INE, right, over its, many, many years, it's 20 years in existence now, hasn't overseen its own set of frauds and has looked the other way through mountains and mountains of corruption in elections. What they want you to believe from the New York Times and the Atlantic is that elections were perfect in Mexico until AMLO started tinkering with things. And that just goes against all kinds of, that goes against completely.
No, I mean, where to even begin? Because one, it's very funny to hear from, and people like that, very, very concerned with the salaries of bureaucrats, right? Because people who are very willing to wage war on that system in the United States somehow very, very worried that some people might be getting salary cuts and some redundancies may be getting, slashed in the Mexican system. But one thing that is very, very telling in a lot of these articles that have been coming out, and in a second, I want to talk more broadly about why you think there is such a plethora of these right now. But one thing that is really, really interesting about both some of the New York Times pieces and some of the Atlantic pieces that I've read is that they talk about AMLO's campaign in 2006, right? And they try to make this connection to Trump's quote unquote stop the steal in 2020. I mean, could you talk a little bit for people who might not be familiar with what happened in 2006 and why that might be a kind of sore spot for AMLO and for Morena?
Yeah, 2006 was AMLO's first presidential election. All right. By all accounts, AMLO won that election, and it was stolen by the then Federal Electoral Institute. After, all kinds of irregularities along the way, precincts where there were more votes than people registered, precincts when then there were less. The count did really weird things the night of the election. And there was actually a very strange thing where when you have candidates that are that close, right? Supposedly AMLO lost by 0.5%. The way the statistics would work would you have one candidate ahead, then another one, then another one, then another one as precincts come in, if they come in randomly, right? That didn't happen that night. The way the count worked was that they ensured that Calderon would be ahead the whole time on the night of the election, right? So there was so many irregularities there that what AMLO said is let's have a recount. Let's have a recount. Sounds pretty normal, right?
We did it here.
Yeah. The law at that time was ambiguous on a recount, but if both sides had gone for it, or if they had ordered it, it could have happened. They refused, and then they proceeded to burn the ballots. So it's funny now that you have people like Natalie Kittereff at the New York Times saying AMLO accuses electoral fraud in 2006, and there's absolutely no evidence for that. Well, they burned the evidence. They burned the evidence, right? And that's when the IFE got the nickname, the Fraudulent Electoral Commission, right? The IFE, right? Mm-hmm. And that's these cosmetic changes to turn it into the INE. In AMLO's second election in 2012, right? AMLO's a very persistent politician. His opponent for the PRI, Enrique Peña Nieto, at that point, they had then put in the law that there was a cap for spending for elections. And if you went over the cap, the election could be annulled and, have to do another election. Peña Nieto spent tons of money in that election. According to a congressional analysis done later, 13 times over the spending cap, right? I mean, he was going everywhere in a private jet. He got money from this Brazilian company, Odebrecht, this construction giant, who's been entangled in corruption scandals across Latin America. But, the INE, see no evil, hear no evil, and they ratified the 2012 election as well. And the only person they tried to sanction for spending problems was AMLO, right? When Peña Nieto did whatever he wanted with electoral law in Mexico. So you get to the point now, and then there have been a series of other, I mentioned a series of scandals in my article, right? Mm-hmm. Nobody else seems to know the history of the INE, right? They just think, the INE oversaw the transition to democracy in 2000 because it handed power from one right-wing party to another. But when push came to shove in 2006 and 2012, and there was actually a center-left candidate in contention, then the INE wasn't that neutral anymore, right? And I think that's important because although David Frum doesn't mention these things, or Ann Applebaum today in the Atlantic, who came down and hung out with some rich people and went to a march, and then went to brunch, and Mexico's a failed state. The Mexican people know the history of INE, right? They know the history of the INE. They know, for example, what was called Operation Sapphire, when governors from the PRI diverted money from their state budgets into the electoral campaigns of 2016, right? Mm-hmm. People know about Operation Berlin, when they spent millions of dollars, again, illegally, in 2018. If you just saw the trial of Genaro Garcia Luna in New York City, the former security minister for Felipe Calderón, right? Who, was found to be guilty of colluding with the Sinaloa cartel. One of the witnesses at that trial was a former finance minister, right? Who said, we diverted money from our state budget into campaigns and into media campaigns to make our politicians look good and to make Garcia Luna look good. Mm-hmm. Where was the INE? Where was the INE for all of this? It was nowhere. It was nowhere to be seen. They were totally colluded with that, pseudo two-party system at the time between the PRI and the PAN, right? And so, although American press doesn't want to talk about this history, people in Mexico know it very clearly.
I mean, I think it's very clear that, obviously because it's in English, but like the audience is not a Mexican audience for these pieces. It's to sort of lay the ground, for more hostile policy from Joe Biden. But even more recently, could you talk a little bit about so all these other things where the INE is sort of uninterested in acting in the defense of Mexican democracy. Could you talk about some of the recent targeting of Morena?
Yeah. So this has been one of the more recent problems for the INE. They've been in the midterm elections in 2021. They disqualified 2 Morena candidates for governor in the states of Guerrero and Michoacan for the fairly minor, peccadillo of not filing an expense report for their primary campaigns. Right? Maybe they should have fined them, But it just this disproportionate act of disqualifying 2 people running for office in light of the blind eye they turned to legendary corruption over the previous years. And there was a series of other Morena candidates who were disqualified as well. I think 49, not just those 2 candidates for governor. And it was targeted at Morena. More recently, the INE has decided now, took it upon themselves that they could now cancel people running for office last year for tweeting. Right? There was a representative called Andrea Chavez. She made a very minor tweet there, right? They said, all right, you can't run again. Because this is violence, gender violence, right? It's kind of the weaponizing of this. She's like, well, I'm a woman.
Yeah.
There was a Morena senator in a debate in Congress who made a fairly anodyne comment about the opposition. The INE went down on her. There was a journalist who was trying to promote the referendum that we talked about for AMLO. And the INE said, no, you're sanctioned because only we can promote the referendum by law. So you have this kind of out of control INE that was all of a sudden deciding that we can cancel candidacies just for a tweet, or because we decided as a private citizen to support the campaign to try to promote participation in a referendum or a plebiscite. So one of the things this electoral law does is says, listen, INE, you can't cancel people's political rights to run for office, right? Which is becoming a dangerous thing. And many in Morena feared that this was heading up, towards being used against the front runner for the presidential candidacy in 2024, who was, Mexico City Mayor Claudia Sheinbaum. If they could cancel Andrea Chavez's candidacy, what couldn't they make up to just all of a sudden say to Sheinbaum, oh, you didn't file an expense report. Oh, you didn't cross, a T or dot an I. You can't run for president. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting now that I think part of this campaign from the United States, from and Kitreff and Applebaum and the like, seeing that Morena has a very large lead heading into 2024 that hasn't eroded, is to find a way to pre-disqualify the 2024 election. And that, to me, is the most dangerous of all of this. That because of AMLO's relatively minor electoral reform law, reducing salaries, reducing bureaucracy, clipping the wings of the INE, to cancel people's political rights and such, all of a sudden, the 2024 election is not going to be trustworthy or fair. So an opposition that has proven that it can't win elections since 2018, now has an out. They can say, this election is flawed from the outset. We're not going to recognize it. And the U.S. press will play along with us. I think that's very, very, very dangerous stuff.
I totally agree. And I think that, this is like going up to what we were talking about at the beginning of the show. We were talking about some of the stuff happening here in Austin with policing, where like it's very advantageous for the right to sort of operate in these like context-free zones, right? Because what's told to the American reader is like AMLO is super scary and he talks to the press every morning, which is somehow dangerous and bad.
Answers questions.
He answers questions and says what he thinks about things. And he's challenging like the electoral authority in Mexico. When upon further analysis, it's very, very clear that all of this kind of thing is like, liberals in America love this concept too, of like things that stand outside of politics, right? That's why like it's been very hard to sort of break their reverence for the Supreme Court, despite the way that the Supreme Court very much expressed itself as a political institution. But it's very, very clear in Mexico that over the past few years, like, that this is not a neutral body. This is a body that is playing politics, that represents a site of power for a right that can't beat AMLO and this new coalition in election. That's right. So they're trying to hold on to it against, again, like AMLO's the one who wins the election. The people are also electing members of Morena. This is what they're wanting to do with the system, to make it more democratic, to make it more open, to prevent the vestiges of the right wing from basically being able to haunt the future. It's just like they can't beat them. So they're trying to create this false narrative that democracy is under attack, when it's very, very clear that, one of the force that's actively operating against democracy is the INE.
Exactly right. And I think it's important to point out, David, that Morena is not going to fall into the trap of the Democrats, that when they have power, they don't do things that they should do. And then, and then they're all, so surprised when these things turn out against them later. Mm-hmm. Right? So, the Democrats decided not to make the Supreme Court larger or pack the Supreme. They decided not to fight when Obama's pick there was blocked, and they didn't have a vote on it, right? Because it's always institutions and this and that. Morena is not that naive, or kind of this faux naive of the Democrats. And they know that once you have a majority, you have to do these things. You can't go by, because that'll come back and bite you, right? The INE has proven that it is a partisan actor in Mexican elections. It is, right? And living very high on the hog, right? I mean, in a country where the minimum wage is $10 a day, you have these top counselors making, $13,000 US a month, $250,000 a year, before taxes, a bevy of benefits, cars, meal budgets, phone budgets, batteries of advisors who all make more than the president. In a country this poor, it's just a slap in the face. It's an insult, right? And it's this old neoliberal idea from the 90s that you have to pay people exorbitant salaries in order to attract talent, or otherwise you won't have anybody worth their salt in the public sector, right? So it's always a very hypocritical argument from the conservatives. They want cost cutting, right? They think cost cutting is good, but not for them, not for their buddies, not for the people at the top. It's cost cutting for everybody else, not when we try to enforce a constitutional provision that nobody can earn more than a certain amount, right? The head of the IFE, the two heads of the IFE actually went to court to try to prevent that constitutional amendment from applying to them. You think people don't see this? That instead of administering elections, they're spending time in court in order to try to prevent a constitutional amendment mandating a salary cap from applying to them? So I think that's important as well. And I think Morena doesn't have this U.S. liberal worship, this abstract worship of institutions.
Yeah.
I think they're not that dumb because they've suffered so many frauds. 2006, 2012, the 2017 state election in the state of Mexico. I mean, it's just they've gone through this so many times, right?
Well, and it's very, very bold of like a David Frum, for example, to come in and speak for the voiceless in Mexico, when we literally have examples of this. I mean, could you talk a little bit about these opposition rallies and then AMLO's rally in Mexico City? Because I know we've had you on Left Reckoning to talk about these in the past, but a lot of these listeners might not be tuning in until they should be tuning into Left Reckoning.
That's right.
I mean, it was two different worlds in your ability to mobilize people, and also two different worlds in the way that each was portrayed in the American media.
Yeah. So the first main election, the first main opposition march was in November of last year, when they marched to save the INE, right, in Mexico City. And what was amazing about it, they certainly had every right to march, and it was, a reasonably march. First of all, the opposition marches in Mexico in general, and I'm sorry, but I have to say this, the opposition marches in Mexico are very white. I mean, they're very white. Not everybody, but they are, right? Because unfortunately, these are very racially stratified societies, and the opposition tends to be just, in a country that is more than 80% mestizo and indigenous, the opposition tends to be disproportionately white, right? Now, in that first march, they forced their help to go because it was Sunday, right? That's the one day that the servants of all these people get off, so they can go and have at least one day to walk around in the park and get an ice cream before they have to go back and serve in all of these, big houses in the rich parts of Mexico City. So they forced some of them to go along, unfortunately. But what's interesting was the degree of racism and classism at this first march. I mean, you'd hear things like they would call, Morena sympathizers Indians.
Mm-hmm.
They would literally call Morena sympathizers Indians. That is an insult in Mexico still, which goes back, of course, to the class stratification of the colony. colonial times, right? They would call them nacos, and nacos is the best translation is kind of I don't know, kind of not redneck, but kind of people with poor taste, people kind of, I don't know what we'd call that exactly. They'd call them patarajadas. Patarajadas are people who have the soles of their feet split from walking barefoot or sandals, right? Mm-hmm. So they were calling Morena sympathizers indios, nacos, and patarrajada. I mean, they weren't hiding it. At this other opposition march a few weeks ago, they were a little bit more tempered, but this was in the wake of the conviction of Garcia Luna, right? Which was huge news in Mexico, that Felipe Calderón's head of public security, right? Felipe Calderón, who stole the election in 2006, thanks to the IFE, his director of public security for 6 years was in bed with the Sinaloa cartel. Why is the US media not talking about that with the same insistence that they're talking about the INE? You'd think David Frum would be talking about that. You'd think Natalie Kitreff would be talking nonstop about that. But they're talking about the INE. They're not talking about Garcia Luna. And I think that has a lot to do with, first of all, protecting former conservative governments. And also there's a degree of which that the United States was very complicit in that. So anyway, the opposition march was a few days after the conviction of Garcia Luna. And you saw these opposition marchers desperately trying to rip down posters that said that Garcia Luna was guilty, right? Mm-hmm. It's like this guilt complex. There was a big sign in Mexico City of Garcia Luna guilty, and they had the insignia of the Conservative Party, the PAN. They were desperately trying to rip this down. This isn't about Garcia Luna. This isn't about Garcia Luna. It's about the INE, even though the politicians in attendance at this march were the same politicians back in the time mm-hmm. that Garcia Luna, or said nothing about it at the time. Now, the Morena March in November, and there's going to be another one on March 18th to celebrate the anniversary of the expropriation of the oil industry. Nice. Totally different thing. First of all, it was much bigger, about 1.5 million people. It was much more representative of Mexico, racially and ethnically. And it was a fun march. I went to cover it. It was fun. It was happy. There were jugglers and there were people up on stilts, and it was like kind of a festival atmosphere. People were singing. There were musicians. It was fun, Mm-hmm. After so much suffering in Mexico, so much suffering. This movement is in power. And they were celebrating that, and they were having fun with it. That was, I think, the big difference. They weren't saying, Indians.
Yeah.
Nacos and such. Well, and the big thing about that march is that AMLO marched with everybody. No security. Mm-hmm. Around it, he was getting pushed around.
But again, you were there, which is it's great to hear you and you shed some light on it, because the way that was covered in America was as if it was like one of the darkest days in Mexican democracy, right? It's like the demagogue AMLO is, sending his minions to threaten the society and the democracy of the country, right? Which again is it's completely backwards, where they want to celebrate, the white people's march. I'll just be blunt about it.
No, it's basically
and then this darkening of Mexican democracy of a little while after. I mean, it's really
the dark-skinned heathen mob, hell bent on destroying the country. Right?
And the whole point of a march is to show, in public, this is who supports this. This is how many people support this. Right outside of an election, this is a way to say this has popular support. This movement has popular support. This idea has popular support. And for some reason, when it happens in Mexico, when it happens when poor and working class people are doing it, it somehow is this threat and dark day, instead of, as you were saying, it's something that was very positive, and also very clearly showing support for this project.
Yeah, and I think it actually shows how politicized Mexico has become over the years. Talking to people there, they knew exactly what was up, what was going on, and what was in play there, right? But these kind of marches scare the elites, and they They're the kind of New York Times liberals who, well, people please think of the institutions, that gave those ignorant masses democracy. And those institutions did nothing of the kind.
Mm-hmm.
They did nothing of the kind. Those institutions were full of people who went to American universities and have American degrees, right? And charge exorbitant salaries, right? While people here suffer through. In Mexico City, usually takes you 2 or 3 hours to get to work, 2 to 3 hours to go home. You've got to take the metro. You've got to take a bus, right? It's a difficult life, right? And they just see these people, these institutions, living so high on the hog, and then just tossing one election after another in their faces over these 20 years. Like, all right. So they broke the rules, they broke the law, they overspent the salary cap. What are you going to do about it? And that was what people had to swallow for decades. What are you going to do about it, right? And so this big idea in 2018 was, well, the INE let AMLO win. No, it didn't. AMLO won by 30 points.
Yeah.
They overwhelmed the ballot boxes. It was too big to steal, right? The tigre, there's this old idea that goes back to the Mexican Revolution. Porfirio Diaz, the dictator, when he was sent into exile to France, he's like, well, they've awoken the tiger now. And the tiger is the Mexican public once they really, really, get upset. It's watch out for the tigre, right? And so they knew they couldn't do anything with a 30-point. They can steal it if it's within a stealable range, right? So the INE didn't do anything. And I think that's very, very important for people to understand, right? First of all, AMLO wouldn't have every right to pass laws because they have the majority, right? And then the second point, which I think is more than obvious, who is the United States to lecture anyone on elections?
Yeah.
I mean, when the winner of the popular vote lost the presidency in 2000 and 2016, when you have gerrymandering, when there are no elections, when you can buy elections outright through dark money and super PACs, who the hell is the United States to lecture Mexico on anything? But they don't see this because, and as I pointed out in my pieces, they don't care about Mexican elections. They don't care about Mexican elections. They've found an issue with which they think they can delegitimize AMLO. Like this idea insults the press, right? This idea, right, that they were on last year, right? Because he dares talk back to people who lie, right? So that's the thing here, With Jeremy Corbyn, they kicked around for years and finally found something that they could stick at him, right? So now AMLO, they kicked around, and now they finally found something they feel will stick. They don't care about Mexican elections. They care about delegitimizing a movement which has every indication that it's going to be in power for quite a long time. The way things are going, at least another 6 years.
Well, I mean, let's get into that a little bit because, I will say, one thing is and maybe just because, I'm from Texas, so just geographically, I think about it a decent amount. It is wild how little coverage we get in this country about what's happening in Mexico, and I'm very happy to be a comrade and show solidarity to our friends in the United Kingdom when they're going through stuff. But it's wild to me how more closely, for example, we follow UK politics or how accessible UK politics information is versus what's happening in Mexico. For the most part, in Mexico, the stories you get are about cartels and about drugs, right? But I have to ask, what do you make? Because this is not an isolated thing. This is not just one from piece, right? You had Barr in the Wall Street Journal with an absolutely saber rattling kind of piece in a lot of ways. You've had very, very critical coverage in the New York Times and Atlantic, across the board. Do you think is it just because the INE is something that the upper middle class, the wealthy in Mexico are trying to use as their wedge issue to try to attack AMLO's project? Or do you think there's some, why is there such attention on this right now? Why right now is there this kind of rhetoric coming from this country?
Well, I think you're right. It is a wedge issue with upper middle class Mexicans who can then plug into upper middle class publications in the U.S., right?
Mm-hmm.
Historical role of the U.S. press in Latin America has always been to be a voice for these castes of upper class people to head off even moderate reforms, head off even moderate reforms. Let's recall that Latin America is, I think, the most unequal continent, region in the world, and Mexico is one of the most unequal countries in the most unequal region. So you would think everybody would be laser focused on reducing inequality, right? I mean, that's what we're talking about. I mean, it's inequality within inequality, right? For one thing. Now, why now? I think is the question, right? Why the battery of pieces in the Times? Why the battery of pieces in the Atlantic? Why did they call him the Tyrant of the Year from this British NGO, right? Tied to the elements of the Labour Party over there, and funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, just as opposition groups in Mexico are funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. And so why now? I have about 3 or 4 reasons. One of them is energy policy. One of the big fights for AMLO over his government has been to take greater control over energy policy, right? Up and against the greenwashers, who are trying to kind of manipulate a green discourse to keep private control of the grid, right? So now the whole argument was that, AMLO loves dirty energy and loves oil and loves coal, even though Mexico just opened one of the largest solar projects in the world in Sonora, right? So AMLO's energy reform law said, very simply, public sources of energy go in the grid first. And then if we need more, private sources can go in. But public energy goes in first. And that includes hydroelectric, that includes the Federal Electricity Commission's plants, and the new sources they're working out. They were totally up in arms about that. Because before, Mexico's energy grid worked through a series of auctions. You had to auction energy, which are easily...
It's like what we have here, which is something that, fails, by the way.
Right.
And also provides very expensive electricity for working people.
Exactly. And when Texas fails, northern Mexico fails.
Yeah, it's true.
Huge blackout a few years ago, that blacked out a big chunk of northern Mexico as well, right? So what's been interesting is to see, as this energy reform progresses, Iberdrola having to hand over the keys to their plants because their license ran out and the licenses aren't being renewed. These Spanish energy companies like Naturgy, like Enel, right? You've got a huge situation in the south of Mexico, for example, with these wind farms are literally on top of some of the poorest villages in Mexico. But the energy wasn't going to those poor villages. The energy was going to Walmart and Mitsubishi and the car companies, right? So that was one big thing, was taking control back of energy and nationalizing lithium, which Mexico did last year. And that was just cemented a few weeks ago when Mexico launched its state lithium company, right? So energy independence is something the United States has never liked, right? Ever. And the other thing is that Mexico is, in its way, becoming a regional leader in Latin America. So you see an AMLO who saved Evo Morales when he was very likely going to be killed after the coup of 2019. They sent a plane for him. They got him out. You saw an AMLO who refused to go to the Summit of the Americas, right, last year, because all of the countries in Latin America weren't invited. They're going to invite you, but not you, and you and not you. He said, all right, I'm not going to go. And the State Department flipped out. You see an AMLO who's called a spade in Peru right now and said that's a coup. That's a coup. And you've got Pedro Castillo unjustly jailed, and the American ambassador, Lisa Kenna, former CIA agent, is advising the coup government. He said this at his press conference, and it's true. That's exactly what's happening. So, going back to the Wolfowitz doctrine in the U.S. policy is designed to make sure that no country has a regional role of, regional leadership, right? You want to discourage people from aspiring to a greater regional role in the, and take control of energy. So that's one thing. I think another thing is the China pivot.
Mm-hmm.
The famous China pivot. So the U.S. wants to bleed Ukraine dry, defeat Russia there, right, and then pivot to China and start a war over there. And they're very upset that China has a big role in Latin America, right? I don't know if you've seen that map, but in the year 2000, the U.S. was the biggest trading partner, I think, of every country in Latin America. And now it's China, and every country except Mexico and 2 or 3 others. And China is now, this whole nearshoring phenomenon post-pandemic. China and other Asian companies are opening factories in Mexico, right? And so part of this is the extension of the Monroe Doctrine saying, no. You're still ours, Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
And especially now that they're, rattling sabers in the Pacific, ostensibly over Taiwan. It's like keeping Mexico on side. And if they're not going to stay on side nicely, well, then we'll sick David Frum on you. Right?
Well, this is a hit, Kurt, but I think it's worth doing really quick. I didn't have it all prepped up for us, so you'll have to deal with my reading voice for a second. But this was a highlight of the Frum piece for me, because basically, again, for people who don't know, like Mexico has a one-term system for president, and like one of these things that you constantly get in these pieces is like AMLO, this dictator in waiting, might want somebody from his political movement to succeed him instead of the opposition.
Oh, a hand-picked successor. Yes.
So, let me just read this paragraph really quick from this David Frum piece in The Atlantic, which was just like, y'all should read it to educate yourself, but it is garbage from the start. Even if I want to be cynical and maybe make a couple grand or something like that, I could write a better anti-AMLO piece than this Frum one. It's just lazy.
Or Jordan Peterson, he could do it in rhyme.
Yeah. This is from the Frum piece. The seeming paradox of all this effort by López Obrador is that one of the enduring taboos in Mexican politics prohibits a president's reelection after a single 6-year term. Why try to manipulate an election in which he himself could not be a candidate? Yet there is a logic here, a logic of power. López Obrador wants to ensure his succession by a completely loyal successor. By all accounts, he has identified such a person, the serving mayor of Mexico City, Claudia Sheinbaum. Right. And then he goes on to basically say that no one would ever want to elect her. No one would ever want to support her. The reason that AMLO is doing all this right now is basically to open up the path for them to win the next presidential election. Because again, AMLO acting completely irrationally in political science, in the political science sphere, by trying to make sure that somebody who's a member of his party who might support that he supports is the person who's in power after his term's over.
Yeah, I think we talked about that in the last on Reckoning as well, right? How dare the president want someone from his party to win, right? And that, humorous as it is, just points to the double standard that exists here.
Mm-hmm.
Something that is just so normal anywhere else, right? All of a sudden in Mexico is dark and autocratic, right? And they don't, they don't see it. Passing laws with a majority, wanting your party to win, cutting costs. Maybe you could have more money to do other things with it than paying, exorbitant salaries to people. All of these things all of a sudden are suspect when someone else does it. And that's part of the American hubris.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Frum's piece was bad. I think Ann Applebaum's piece was, if possible, even worse.
Mm-hmm.
Give that one a read. Ann goes, trotting down to Mexico, hangs out with the head of the INE in his office, Lorenzo Córdoba, and then goes to the White March with one of the journalists who most hates AMLO there. And I think she has a real good time at that march. And then, they head off to brunch, right? And then she decides that Mexico is on the point of collapse based on those two voices alone, right? It would be funny if it weren't.
No, you're right.
Yes, actually, because you have people like on one side, Dan Crenshaw and Mike Waltz, right? These, people who are saying and Barr saying we have to bomb the cartels, right? And we're going to use of force resolution to bomb the cartels, right? As if you can very easily just bomb a cartel without killing thousands of people, causing untold suffering and setting off massive migration flows. All right. We're going to play video games and bomb the cartels. Now, some of that is political posturing, fine. But then you have people like Bob Menendez on the other side giving bipartisan cover for that. Because Menendez, right, is buying into this, right? This is setting back the clock on democracy and all of these things, sabotaging Mexico's democratic institutions, right? So what that does is all of a sudden it starts a little ball rolling, right? The Republicans want to bomb Mexico, so they've got an enemy. And the Democrats have a cause. They have a cause so that they can feel morally superior, right? They want to save democracy from an autocrat. And they want to, like Woodrow Wilson going down and intervening in the Mexican Revolution by occupying Veracruz. And how many thousands of Mexicans did they kill there, right? They have a cause. And so what I'm worried is you have this kind of the most brutish element of the Republicans, and which is, I think, even worse, this kind of sermonizing, moralizing, establishment liberal cause of saving democracy. And those two could create, if we're not careful, a perfect storm for Mexico. Right when, between the Russia to China pivot, they could kind of sweep through Mexico. Now, do I think that's something that's likely or is going to happen tomorrow? No. Do I think it's possible? Well, yes. We saw Libya. We saw Syria, right? The United States has occupied or intervened in every country in Latin America over the course of history, and many of them multiple times, right? Or they're trying to provoke a color revolution from inside, right? This time, color pink for the INE, right? All these white people wearing their pink caps so they don't get sunburnt, right? Average age 77. It's going to be hard to create a color revolution with that, but they can try.
Yeah, no, and I think it is something to be worried about, and I want to be explicit about this. It's like obviously the Republicans are like the drum beaters, like they're awful, but so much of this also plays in when like the Democratic Party has control, at least of like the executive branch, and here, like we have my governor in the state of Texas operating parallel border operations to the federal government, right?
Right.
Like drop the humanitarian stuff for a second, right? Like that should infuriate Joe Biden, right? In the sense that basically there's been silence on that is very worrying when, of course, you have Abbott who would love nothing more than, to create some kind of incident, or a Crenshaw who's definitely playing this up, because he's trying to catch up because now he's a rhino. He's a Republican in name only, apparently, despite being one of the most hawkish and psychotic. I don't know. The Republican base will never be pleased. But what's really amazing about these stories that you're getting in, let's just be honest, like the liberal press, right? The Atlantic, the New York Times and stuff, is that there's all of these tiers for Mexican democracy, right? And how it's under threat and the INE and all this kind of stuff. But I don't know, call me old fashioned, right? But I think that when you're talking about democracy, there's a voice that's very, very, that's missing from this conversation, which is the people of Mexico who have regularly shown their support for one side. And, the story is very much something that is meant for consumption by people far, far away who get no news, information, or perspective from Mexico, apart from very, very well-connected elites. And it's just I don't know, as somebody who does these kind of programs, and we talk about, other countries as well, right? You always get one person just well, I'm this and I hate AMLO, right? Or I'm from Peru and I think Pedro Castillo is dangerous, or I think Evo Morales is a dictator, right? It's Yeah, I mean, it's not that surprising to me if you take like a sample of like people who are connected and are doing these kind of things in the United States,
right,
and maybe have a current position on AMLO that might not be reflective of the vast majority of people, let alone like working class, poor people.
My Venezuelan friend, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, yeah, says, that's very, very true. I think, and what's interesting about Mexico is, whereas most people from other South American countries in the United States, those who get there are going to be from the middle and upper middle classes, right? Mm-hmm. The wealthy. Mexico is an interesting case because the Mexican community in the United States are mostly working class. Mm-hmm. It's a phenomenon to Peru, Ecuador, Venezuela. The Mexicans in the United States are the ones who came looking for work, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And it's those Mexicans who overwhelmingly support AMLO in the United States.
Totally.
Overwhelmingly support AMLO.
Like,
those are the people
anecdote. My personal experience here, when I talk to people from Mexico who live here now, like, AMLO's good, right? But when I get comments on YouTube, when I get people on Twitter, it's a different.
It's a different demographic, isn't it? And part of what people hate about this electoral reform is that those Mexican migrants in the United States are now going to vote in presidential elections. Mm-hmm. They don't want that. They don't want that, right? It's like the Republicans don't want DC statehood, right? Well, Biden doesn't either, apparently.
Well, he wants it, but he also doesn't.
He doesn't want it, right? That's what's underlying this. There's crude political calculation here, right? They don't want, X millions of Mexicans to be able to vote in their consulate or in their embassy with their passports or with an official document, right? Mm. Because INE won't be there. Now, legitimate question as to how that will work, right? But this is something every country works out. Right? Every country has a mechanism for people who are living abroad to vote. Mm-hmm. Why can't Mexico have that? Why can't Mexico have a mechanism where the millions of migrants who, through no fault of their own, had to leave their country can participate in their electoral system? No. That's one of the big things that's behind this, right? And I think that's something that isn't talked about. Right, the fact that they've enshrined into law minority quotas for candidacies wasn't talked about. I go back again to the pretrial detention and right to vote for people. Sometimes people in Mexico are in pretrial detention for years if they can't pay for bail. They can be in pretrial detention for years the way the justice system is, and their political rights. Right? Shouldn't they be able to vote? Shouldn't they be able to participate politically? But these people don't count for the Ann Applebaums and the Frums of the world. People who are in prison, people who are migrants and want to vote, right? People who want to have access to candidacies from gender and minority positions, right? That doesn't enter into this, right? What enters into this are the few restricted voices that the New York Times and the Atlantic listen to, which are friends of theirs, or people in think tanks, right? Like the Baker Institute there in Rice in Texas, or the Wilson Center, or these other think tanks hitched to U.S. universities, which hire the most conservative upper class Mexicans, right? Give them nice fat salaries, and then hook them up and connect them up to media. Mm-hmm. So that's why you always get the exact same people being interviewed in U.S. media pieces. Jorge Castaneda, right? Luis Rubio, Carlos Bravo Regidor. All the same people. They just recycle. Recycle. They just need something on Mexico. Let me grab somebody from the think tank, whatever else, and then you've got your piece. And that's why these pieces are so bad.
They're truly sloppy. And look. There will be people in Mexico. There will be people who even listen to this thing and they'll say, like, I don't like AMLO, whatever. I will just say this. It's like, this is why you have a democracy. And it seems that when these questions are asked to the Mexican people, they line up on one side. And I think that's the people who are always ignored, right? As like they're being bamboozled or tricked by this, magician from Tabasco. We went a little over, but I did really want to ask you really quick, Kurt,
sure.
Because I think I sent it. I DM'd this to you when it happened, but there was this thing about AMLO, and I'm forgetting the name there, but like him posting a picture of like, allegedly like an elf, right?
Oh, the illusion.
Yeah, and everyone had like a field day with it, which is like he's just like tweeting, having like fun, you know what I mean?
Having a good time.
Like the and honestly, like the subtext of a lot of those attacks, I think were really dark. We're attacking his connection to indigenous traditions in Mexico. But apart from that, right? I don't even want to jump into that that bog right now. I'm not surprised because I see this happen all the time, but I was like frustrated when I was reading like the Reuters and the AP coverage of that. The way that they describe this Tren Maya, his almost quote pet project. Could you just give people who might not be familiar with what that is, like a sense of what that project is? Because the way that like English speaking American audience are being sort of, what they're being told is that like crazy AMLO is like, making a choo-choo train, Disney style, like choo-choo train, and, is wasting a bunch of money and is, just like doing political theater. And I think it's worth it for people to have a little bit of context and understanding of what that project is.
Sure. So the train is called the Maya train because it goes to the Yucatan Peninsula. It's actually a very long, I think it's 2,000 kilometers around. It starts in Palenque, the Mayan ruins of Palenque, and it goes all the way through the Yucatan Peninsula and back. And the idea is to create a train for tourists and also for locals and also for workers to be able to visit the whole network of sites in the Yucatan Peninsula, right? So it's a modern train with sleeping cars and a dining car and nice up there. Well, this was one of AMLO's cardinal projects for the southeast of Mexico, which has traditionally not received investment. Investment has usually been concentrated in Mexico City and in the north, and the southeast has been neglected. It's worth pointing out that this is part of a plan to connect all of Mexico with trains by 2050. Mm-hmm. It's to connect up all the country, basically build a train network again. Mexico used to have a train network, but surprise, surprise, it was sold off in the privatizations of the 90s, largely under former President Ernesto Zedillo, who then joined the board of one of the companies that bought one of the privatized train networks and then ditched it, right? Mm-hmm. Mexicans used to travel on trains. And so they're trying to rebuild a train network. Now, I think we could have a whole other program on the Maya train, and there are voices there are concerns that it's going to potentiate kind of the wrong kind of tourism, kind of tourism of, let's just go see the ruins and hop on a train, rather than local tourism that helps local indigenous groups. There's an argument to be made there. And I think that's very important, and I don't want to minimize that. But what you saw in that piece in Reuters was this idea. AMLO just posted this kind of a funny thing that way he was seeing the Maya train, and he's like, "We saw an aluche in the tree." Aluche is kind of a mythic character in the Maya tradition, and supposedly they only come out at night and they're spirit animals or whatever else, right? And he said Mexico is mystical. Right. So you get this piece in Reuters that said the president appeared to be serious when he said this aluche thing, like it was real. Right. And it is dark, like you say, because on one hand, they want to paint AMLO as being an authoritarian dictator. On the other hand, they want to paint him as being a mystical buffoon.
Yep.
During the pandemic, he mentioned at one point that somebody on one of his trips had given him a little image of the Virgen de Guadalupe, right? A little amulet. And he says, with my amulet, I'm protected from the pandemic, right? He was making a little off the comment. And then all of a sudden it's, mystical AMLO believes that you can ward off COVID with amulets. Because they're just, let's go back to the march, right? They're just Indians to the upper class Mexicans and to their American compatriots. They're just Indians. And of course, Indians would believe that you can ward off diseases with amulets. And of course, Indians believe in aluches in trees because they're just Indians. right? That's what they said at the opposition march. They're just Indians. So, what is it? What is he? Is he a dictator? Or is he the buffoon? Or is he one or the other when it's convenient?
Well,
dehumanizing.
Convenience is the point here, and the reason I bring up the train is that you should notice when something's convenient, because if David Frum was somebody who is very consistent, for example, in being worried about pipelines being built through indigenous lands and in the United States and the environmental concerns, that'd be one thing. But when it seems that he is particularly outraged about AMLO's investment in the southeast of the country on those grounds, it's probably because the wrong people are getting investment in David Frum's mind.
I think that's absolutely right. If you have long-term concerns about the environment and about indigenous rights in the Yucatan, those voices must be heard. But Frum, all of a sudden, when it's convenient, is attacking AMLO from the left all of a sudden, right? David Frum, right? Well, he's not spending as much on social spending as he says he was, right? Mm-hmm. He's not on the left. David Frum is an expert on who's on the left and who isn't, right? It's just really.
Sorry.
Whatever side, and you see this in Mexico all the time too. People who are on the right pretending to be from the left and saying AMLO isn't on the left because I know who's on the left and who isn't, right? We could have, if it were in good faith, a whole program as to what Morena is, right? Mm-hmm. Not socialist.
Yes.
It's center left, and there are problems with Morena, right? But that requires a good faith discussion of saying, let's sit down and see what Morena is doing well, what it's not, what its philosophy is, right? And that's not what they're doing. Here, they're just finding whatever entry they can to hit.
Yep.
That's what they're doing. It's just mercenary politics at its worst. So those people you can't even take seriously. And write a considered response to David. Why? Or Ann Applebaum, or no, because the point isn't to be serious.
Yes.
This point is simply to hit. They're just political hits, and they're very clumsy political hits. Fortunately, they're very clumsy. Right? Would they were more sophisticated, we'd be having even a more serious problem.
Look, and we've said this on Left Reckoning in the past, and again, the point here is not that AMLO is without criticism, as you just said. Look, I'm a socialist. I don't necessarily see this movement to be representative of the kind of socialist party movement that I want to see. But when it's very, very clear that the right is basically just trying to attack the democratic process and the fact that poor working class people have some semblance of power, Lord knows I'm going to be standing with the person that they're being attacked, that's being attacked by these kind of ghouls, right? And look, it's worthwhile being intellectually honest about these things, but it's very, very clear that if you do want any kind of opening for maybe a more radical politics or more socialist politics, it's not going to come from a fervent opposition to AMLO and the Morena project, but recognizing what it represents, understanding where it can go, and pushing back against these attacks from the David Frums, the Atlantic, and the New York Times on a project that has achieved a significant amount for people and is opening up a lot of doors for positive change in Mexico.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's this idea of critical support, right? Yeah. And it's where being where the movement is at the moment, right? I would remind people that the history of Latin America is not socialist utopias. Mm-hmm. The history of Latin America is governments being overthrown by coups that even try to make moderate change. That's the history of Latin America. So I think we have to situate ourselves in the continent we're in, right? The history of Latin America is governments that did even less than AMLO has done getting overthrown, like that in the past, right? Fortunately, times have changed. And so I would conclude by saying to the American left, if you're interested in Mexico, if you're interested in Latin America, if you're interested in anti-imperialism and anti-interventionism, and socialist internationalism, now is the time. Now is the time to stand up for Mexico.
Yes.
That's the time. On social media, in DSA meetings, and workplaces where might have Mexican work colleagues, right? There's a cross ethnic, this is a cross-border working class between, Mexicans in the U.S. and Mexicans in Mexico. You see that most of the people in the strikes in the U.S. over the last few years are Spanish speakers, mostly women, large Mexican representation. To be talking about these things with your coworkers, to be talking about these pieces, to be getting the word out there. There's a great project called the Mexico Solidarity Project that is working on this, because it seems like a joke that they could bomb Mexico, but it's a joke until it happens. And I think socialists, this is the time to be active on this. This is the time right now. I would put that out there to people.
No, I mean, thank you so much on that. I totally agree. I mean, look, I'm like an internationalist. I think it's great that we show solidarity with Lula. I think it's great that we show solidarity with Jeremy Corbyn. We should get a lot better and a lot more well-versed in what's happening to our neighbors in Mexico, and really build a serious, coalition of working class people, and have that be first and foremost in a lot of the things that we're doing. Kurt, as always, appreciate talking with you on Left Reckoning. Really was happy that you were able to join me this week on Give Them an Argument. There are links to Kurt's piece in Jacobin. Y'all should follow Kurt on Twitter as well to keep abreast on all these things. Really appreciate it, brother. And I'm sorry if it went a little long, but I always really do enjoy talking to you. I feel like I can do it for a couple more.
No, it's my pleasure. I really appreciate the time to have this kind of considered conversation about what's going on in Mexico. I really appreciate the time and the invitation always.
All right, well, take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
Well, folks, you heard it there. Seriously, follow Kurt on Twitter. Read the pieces in Jacobin. I mean, these are really, really critical issues. And not trying to sound the alarm too early, but you should be worried when a lot of these kind of State Department ghouls and certain characters start focusing a lot of their attention on that part of the world. And the left needs to be strong enough to be able to be a real force in pushing back against some of these jingoistic attacks there.
Yeah, I agree with you and with Dave Ellis, an awesome guest. I knew some of the basics that was going on, but that was extremely informative. And I would urge people, as I did, as I was listening to the interview, to go look at those Times articles, or at least the two that I found. Google, really Google that shit. First, I see this article that says, 100,000 people show up to protest against AMLO. And then I look up the article about the march that AMLO actually led, and they cover it, right, but they either don't the number or they bury it, right,
or they make it seem like it's really, really dark. So one thing we do on Left Reckoning a lot, for people not to self-promote too much, but we've had Kurt on multiple times, and usually when we bring him on, we get him to to look at one of these pieces, and we sort of take it line by line. The most recent one we did was exposing how the New York Times lies about Mexico with Kurt, and we literally talk about the way that these things are covered here, because look, it is dangerous. And as somebody who tries to cover Mexico in the US, it's also really hard to get information, because there's not a lot of English coverage of what's happening there, and most of the stuff that you get is this really, really wild stuff, predominantly coming out of places like the New York Times, which are pushing these kind of fantastical narratives of what's happening in Mexico. And I try to have a little bit of patience, in the sense of just knowing that people are sort of inundated with wild stories and sort of inaccurate information. But that probably means that it's a place for us on the left to sort of be stepping into that void and pushing back against this stuff.
I 100%. And by the way, with AMLO's marches, they say tens of thousands, and for the most recent one was 100,000. So given what Kurt was saying about what he is estimating 5 million versus 100,000, if there was potentially 10 times the make it sound like that. And they also mentioned very, very early on what they're protesting again, and they bring up all of the criticisms of AMLO really early on. So that sounds like a very good exercise that y'all are doing. And I agree with you. I think that I think with the New York Times on certain issues, it's easier maybe to slip one by the goalie, right? Where people don't want to be neoliberal. They don't want to be on the same side as some of these conservative ghouls, right? So in some of these issues, like domestically, it's probably much harder for them to slip this by. You don't really know what's going on so much. You read one or two articles about this. It's very easy for them to paint the picture over them. So I agree with you that it's important. I think that you're going to actually get a lot of people who earnestly want to learn.
Yeah, no, totally.
Who just got the wrong.
I think so, 100%. Well, folks, I mean, I'm happy for it. The interview with Kurt went on a little bit long, so I think if we do talk about Palestine and Bama, it might be in the post game. If that sounds good with y'all, I think it might be time to jump over. We have some really, really exciting Jordan Peterson developments that are coming up. He's written a book for children, which is, it's funny, like the right's so worked up about like what the left is doing to kids. Read this stuff that we're about to show y'all and tell me if you would feel comfortable having your kids interact with the stuff. It's very, very dark, and I would not endorse it. So we'll be doing that. We'll be joined by C. Derek Varn. We also have a musical number, which I have not heard, so I'll be hearing it live with all of y'all, with Mr. Jordan Peterson playing a leading or at least a major role in. So we'll have all that and more in the post game. Patreon.com/GTAA, correct? Is that the link?
Sounds right.
All right, we'll join up. Come hang out with us in the post game. Really appreciate all of the GTAA crew and how we put this together. It's really nice to sit in for Ben this week. It's not over going over the post game, but for all the people who are hanging out on the public side, thank you so much for listening. Maybe tune into Left Reckoning sometime if you haven't already. Matt and I have some pretty fun stuff cooked up for this week as well. So everyone take care, and we'll see you all in a couple minutes in the post game.
Left is best.